"Take that medal off before you speak," the judge said, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom with the confidence of a man who believed no one would question his authority. A hush swept across the room so completely that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner above the polished oak walls. Every pair of eyes shifted toward me. My wife lowered her chin just enough to hide a smile, but not enough to hide her satisfaction. She thought she had already won. Her attorney adjusted his tie with the relaxed confidence of someone preparing to celebrate. Reporters along the back row raised their phones, ready to capture what they believed would become another ordinary divorce story. They had no idea they were about to witness something entirely different. I looked down at the Navy cross resting against the dark fabric of my suit. The silver edges caught the morning sunlight pouring through the courthouse windows. I had worn it only a handful of times since receiving it. Funerals, memorial ceremonies, Veterans Day. Today had not been my choice. My attorney insisted the medal represented the truth about my character, especially after months of accusations that painted me as selfish, dishonest, and manipulative. I slowly raised my eyes toward the bench. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "before I remove something I earned serving this country, may I ask for 60 seconds? The room became even quieter. "My name is Ethan Walker. I am 42 years old, born and raised in Norfolk, Virginia. For nearly 2 decades, I served in the United States Navy before building a logistics company from the ground up after returning to civilian life. I believed that hard work, loyalty, and keeping my word were enough to build a good life. I believed the same principles could hold a marriage together. Looking back now, I realize foundations rarely collapse all at once. They crack in silence long before anyone notices. Claire and I had been married for 14 years. From the outside, our life looked like something people envied. A beautiful brick home outside Annapolis. 2 reliable vehicles in the driveway. Weekend dinners with neighbors. Charity events. Vacations whenever our schedules allowed. People often told us we looked perfect together. Funny how perfection is usually the first lie people believe. The divorce had already dragged on for 7 exhausting months. Every hearing brought a new accusation. Claire claimed I controlled every financial decision. She claimed I cared more about my business than my family. She claimed my military career had become nothing more than a performance designed to earn sympathy. Every statement landed like another stone added to a backpack I had been carrying for years. I never raised my voice. I never interrupted her testimony. Some people mistake silence for weakness. They forget silence also belongs to men who know the truth does not become stronger simply because it is shouted louder. This morning felt different the moment I walked through the courthouse doors. The deputies avoided eye contact. My attorney spoke fewer words than usual. Even the hallway outside courtroom 4 carried a strange heaviness that settled across my shoulders like cold rain before a storm. Then the judge entered, glanced at the medal on my chest, and without hearing a single argument, ordered me to remove it because, in his words, this courtroom has no place for personal displays designed to influence justice. Claire smiled wider than she had in months. She believed that sentence stripped away more than a decoration. She believed it stripped away my dignity. She never noticed the sealed manila envelope resting quietly on my attorney's table or the federal courier who had walked into the courthouse less than 10 minutes earlier. Neither did the judge. And sometimes, the smallest unopened envelope carries the weight to change everything. I used to believe medals belonged to history. They were reminders of chapters already finished, not trophies meant to impress strangers. That was why the Navy Cross spent most of its life inside a wooden case in my study instead of hanging on a wall. Visitors rarely noticed it. I preferred it that way. The men I had served beside understood something many civilians never did. Honor becomes quieter with age. It stops asking for attention and starts asking only to be remembered. When Claire first learned the story behind the medal, she cried before I finished telling it. She held my hand across our kitchen table and whispered that she had never been prouder of anyone in her life. Years later, standing in that courtroom, I found myself wondering when admiration had quietly become embarrassment. My years in uniform shaped every habit I carried into civilian life. I still woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. Coffee always brewed before 5:30. My shoes stayed lined up beside the door. Every tool in my garage had its place. Some people called it discipline. I simply called it respect for the next day. Walker Harbor Logistics grew because those habits never changed. Deliveries left on time. Drivers knew I would never ask them to do something I would not do myself. Clients trusted my word because I never promised what I could not deliver. Business magazines later described me as a visionary entrepreneur. The truth was far less glamorous. I was a former Navy officer who believed showing up early solved more problems than clever speeches ever could. Claire gradually stopped seeing those habits as strengths. She began calling them old-fashioned. At business dinners, she would gently interrupt whenever conversations drifted toward my military years. She preferred discussing investment portfolios, luxury developments, and exclusive social clubs. I noticed she introduced me less as a decorated veteran and more as the founder of a successful logistics company. The difference sounded small, but it carried weight. One honored where I came from. The other focused only on what people believed I was worth. Looking back, I should have recognized how often money had replaced character in our conversations. She no longer asked whether our employees received good health coverage. She asked whether our competitors owned larger vacation homes. She stopped measuring success by the families we supported and started measuring it by the people who requested invitations to our dinner parties. Every achievement became another rung on a ladder that never seemed high enough. Then came the afternoon that stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. We attended a charity luncheon honoring military families. Several young sailors approached our table to thank me for speaking at a veterans event months earlier. They asked if I would pose for a photograph. I happily agreed. Claire smiled for the cameras, but during the drive home she stared through the windshield and quietly said, "Sometimes I wish people would stop seeing you as the military hero and start seeing us as successful people." She probably expected me to laugh it off. Instead, I kept both hands on the steering wheel and watched the highway stretch toward the horizon. That sentence lingered in the truck long after the conversation ended. I realized she had said us, but what she truly meant was herself. Even then, I convinced myself it was only stress, only exhaustion, only another rough season in a long marriage. I had spent too many years believing storms always passed. I failed to notice that this one had already changed the direction of the tide. The courtroom faded into the background as another memory surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. Success did not arrive in one dramatic moment. It arrived one contract, one handshake, and one early morning at a time. Walker Harbor Logistics expanded from 2 leased trucks to a fleet that moved cargo along the East Coast. We hired veterans returning to civilian life because I knew how difficult that transition could be. Some had driven supply convoys overseas. Others had managed complex operations under impossible deadlines. They did not need charity. They needed opportunity. Watching those men and women rebuild their lives became the part of my business I valued most. Claire admired it in the beginning. She often told people our company had a purpose beyond profit. Somewhere along the road, that purpose became less important than appearances. Our guest list changed. Weekend barbecues disappeared, replaced by formal dinners where conversations revolved around stock portfolios, luxury real estate, and private investment funds. I attended because I believed supporting my wife mattered, but every event left me feeling like I had accidentally walked into someone else's life. One evening, at a waterfront fundraiser in Baltimore, I stood near the balcony speaking with 2 retired Marines about a nonprofit scholarship program. Claire approached wearing a designer evening gown that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. She smiled politely, slipped her arm through mine, and gently guided me away before quietly saying, "You should spend more time talking to investors. The veterans already admire you. They cannot help your image anymore." I looked at her, unsure whether I had heard correctly. She spoke those words with complete sincerity, as though she were offering practical advice, instead of revealing how differently we now measured people. That night, I drove home alone after claiming I needed to check on the warehouse. In reality, I parked beside the loading docks long after every employee had gone home. The building smelled of cardboard, diesel fuel, and fresh lumber. Strange how a warehouse filled with silent pallets felt more honest than a ballroom full of expensive conversations. I sat on the tailgate of my truck and wondered whether success had changed Claire or whether it had simply uncovered parts of her that had always been there. I never found an answer. The months that followed became filled with little moments that seemed harmless by themselves. She stopped wearing her wedding ring to networking events because it looked too traditional with certain outfits. She hired a public relations consultant who suggested I appear less often beside her during interviews because independent branding generated better media coverage. Family dinners gradually turned into business meetings where I happened to occupy a chair at the table. Every compromise sounded reasonable until I looked back and realized they all pointed in the same direction. One evening, I opened the mail and found an invitation to a military appreciation banquet where I had been asked to receive recognition for mentoring young veterans. Before I could respond, Claire glanced at the envelope and casually said, "You should probably skip that one. We already have another gala that weekend. Besides, those military events keep reminding people about your past instead of our future." Our future. Those words echoed through the quiet kitchen after she walked upstairs. I stood there holding the unopened invitation, feeling something shift inside me. A marriage rarely breaks because of one argument. It breaks because one person slowly stops respecting what made the other who they are. I folded the invitation, placed it carefully in my desk drawer beside the Navy Cross display case. And for the first time since leaving the Navy, I wondered whether I had spent years defending a future that only one of us still believed in. The divorce papers arrived on a quiet Thursday morning in an oversized white envelope that looked no different from a utility bill. I signed for the delivery, thanked the courier, and carried it into the kitchen while my coffee was still hot. Outside, the sun reflected off the bay behind our house, and a pair of sailboats drifted across the calm water as though nothing in the world had changed. Inside that envelope, everything had. Claire was not simply asking to end our marriage. She was asking the court to redefine the story of our entire life together. According to the petition, she claimed she had been the driving force behind Walker Harbor Logistics, that I had hidden assets, manipulated financial records, and used my military reputation to influence business relationships. Reading those pages felt stranger than painful. It was like watching someone describe a man I had never met. My attorney, Daniel Brooks, called less than an hour later. His voice stayed calm, the way experienced lawyers learn to sound when clients are living through the worst days of their lives. He told me not to respond emotionally, not to contact Claire directly, and most importantly, not to underestimate how carefully the case had been prepared. That sentence stayed with me. Cases are not built overnight. Neither are betrayals. During discovery, more pieces slowly appeared. Claire had already hired forensic accountants months before filing for divorce. Financial consultants had reviewed company records long before I realized our marriage was ending. Every move suggested planning instead of impulse. What surprised me most was not the legal strategy. It was how confidently she spoke about me during depositions. She described me as controlling, obsessed with status, and emotionally distant. I listened to the recordings with my attorney in complete silence. The woman speaking sounded convincing because she mixed small truths with larger distortions. Yes, I worked long hours. Yes, I valued discipline. Yes, I expected promises to mean something. But she transformed responsibility into control and consistency into coldness. That is the danger of selective truth. It sounds believable because part of it actually happened. The requests kept growing. She wanted half the company, several investment accounts, our waterfront home, and additional compensation based on what her attorneys called reputational damages caused by living in the shadow of my public image. That phrase almost made me laugh. For years, she had asked me to stop talking about my military service. Now she claimed it had unfairly benefited our marriage. Contradictions become easier to tell when people stop expecting questions. Daniel noticed something else that bothered him even more. The judge assigned to our case repeatedly approved procedural requests unusually quickly. Deadlines shifted in Claire's favor. Motions from our side waited longer than expected. None of it proved wrongdoing, but together they formed a pattern that experienced attorneys rarely ignored. Daniel never accused anyone directly. Instead, he quietly began requesting additional public records and filing routine disclosure motions that seemed almost unnecessary at the time. I trusted his instincts because they reminded me of something I had learned years earlier. Small details often reveal larger truths. The morning of our final hearing, Daniel handed me a sealed manila envelope marked confidential. He simply looked at me and said, "Do not ask what is inside yet. If everything happens the way I think it will, we will only need to open it once." I nodded, slipped the envelope beside my chair in the courtroom, and watched Claire confidently arrange her notes across the counsel table. She looked completely certain the day belonged to her. She never once glanced toward the unopened envelope, resting only a few feet away. The judge barely acknowledged my request for 60 seconds before leaning back in his chair with visible impatience. He folded his hands, glanced at the courtroom clock, and spoke as though the matter had already been decided. This court will not allow emotional displays to influence these proceedings. His words echoed across the room, while several reporters continued typing without looking up. Claire sat perfectly still, her expression calm, almost rehearsed. She had the confidence of someone who believed every important conversation had already happened before anyone entered the courtroom. Daniel remained seated beside me, quietly organizing documents with the patience of a man waiting for the right tide instead of fighting the current. I had seen that look before. Good captains never rushed rough water. Claire's attorney stood and began presenting their final arguments. He described me as a successful businessman who had hidden behind military recognition to build an image of unquestioned integrity. According to him, my reputation had intimidated business partners, influenced negotiations, and even affected public perception during the divorce. He spoke about the Navy Cross as though it were a marketing campaign instead of a symbol earned decades earlier. Every sentence sounded polished. Every accusation fit neatly into a carefully prepared story. The judge nodded several times while taking notes. Then his eyes settled on the medal once again. "Mr. Walker," he said firmly, "I will instruct you one final time. Remove the decoration. It serves no legal purpose in this courtroom." I looked at the silver cross resting against my jacket. For a brief moment, I remembered the wooden display case in my study, the quiet Veterans Day ceremonies, and the promise I had made to myself never to wear it for attention. I slowly reached toward it. Across the aisle, Claire relaxed her shoulders, believing she had finally broken the last piece of the man she once married. Instead of unclasping the medal, I rested my hand over it and calmly looked back at the bench. "Your Honor," I said, "I respect this court. I have respected every lawful authority my entire adult life. But before I remove something that represents service recognized by the United States government, I respectfully ask that one document be entered into the record." Daniel quietly stood. Without raising his voice or showing the slightest emotion, he lifted the sealed manila envelope from our table. The room immediately grew still. Even Claire turned toward it for the first time that morning. The judge frowned. "Counselor, what exactly is in that envelope?" Daniel answered with remarkable calm. "Your Honor, these documents arrived by federal courier less than 30 minutes before today's hearing. They concern matters that directly affect the integrity of these proceedings." Claire's attorney objected immediately, arguing that any late submission should be rejected. Daniel did not argue back. He simply placed the sealed envelope on the clerk's desk and stepped away. The courtroom clerk examined the federal seal, paused, and quietly handed the package toward the bench. The judge's confident expression softened for the first time that day. He hesitated before breaking the seal. I noticed his eyes move across the first page, then the second. The color slowly disappeared from his face. He stopped reading midway through the next document, looked toward Daniel, then toward Claire's legal team, before quietly asking for a brief recess. No one spoke. No one moved. The courtroom that had been so certain of its outcome only moments earlier suddenly felt uncertain. As deputies escorted the judge through the side door, I glanced toward the empty bench and realized something important. Power often looks permanent until the moment truth quietly walks into the room, carrying nothing more than a sealed envelope. The courthouse hallway buzzed with whispers the moment the judge disappeared behind the chamber's door. Reporters stopped chasing quick headlines and started making phone calls. Deputies exchanged uncertain glances. Even the courtroom clerk, who had barely looked up all morning, stared toward the closed door with growing concern. Daniel never celebrated. He quietly returned to his chair, folded his hands on the table, and waited. That calm told me more than any words could have. Whatever was inside those documents was not speculation. It was fact. Nearly 20 minutes passed before another courtroom deputy entered carrying a folded note. He handed it directly to the clerk, who read it twice before quietly announcing that the hearing would resume under the supervision of the county's chief administrative judge. A murmur rolled across the gallery. Claire turned toward her attorney for the first time that morning, searching for reassurance. Instead, he looked genuinely unsettled. His confident posture had disappeared. The substitute judge entered without ceremony, greeted both legal teams, and immediately addressed the unusual interruption. The court has received official notice concerning matters that require immediate review before these proceedings may continue. His tone carried none of the irritation from earlier. It was careful, measured, almost cautious. Daniel stood only after receiving permission. "Your Honor," he began. "The documents delivered this morning include a formal notice from the Judicial Conduct Commission confirming an active ethics investigation involving the previously assigned judge. They also contain financial disclosure records showing that an investment partnership connected to his immediate family holds a significant ownership interest in a legal consulting company that has received compensation from the law firm representing Mrs. Walker." Silence settled over the courtroom like heavy winter air. Daniel continued before anyone could interrupt. "We are not asking this court to reach conclusions today. We are simply asking that the official records now before the court be recognized for what they are. They establish an undisclosed conflict requiring immediate reassignment under state judicial ethics rules." Claire's attorney slowly stood, but the confidence that had filled his voice all morning was gone. He argued that neither he nor his client had personal knowledge of those financial relationships. The new judge listened carefully, then nodded. Whether either party knew is not the immediate question. The integrity of these proceedings is. He requested certified copies from the clerk and reviewed several pages in complete silence. I watched his eyes move steadily across each document, occasionally marking a line with his pen. No one dared interrupt him. Claire lowered her gaze toward the table. For the first time since the divorce began, she looked uncertain rather than victorious. The reporters had stopped typing altogether. They simply watched. After several long minutes, the judge placed the papers neatly together. "Effective immediately," he said. "All substantive rulings entered during the final phase of this matter will be suspended pending administrative review. This case will proceed only after an independent evaluation of the disclosed information." His words landed softly, yet they changed the direction of everything. The advantage Claire believed she held for months disappeared in a single announcement. Daniel quietly placed one hand on my shoulder before sitting down again. He never smiled. Neither did I. There was nothing joyful about watching institutions correct their own mistakes. There was only relief. As I looked across the courtroom, I realized the Navy Cross had never been the true issue. It had simply become the excuse that revealed a far larger truth waiting beneath the surface. When the hearing resumed under the new judge, the atmosphere inside the courtroom no longer resembled the confidence that had filled it only an hour earlier. Every word carried more weight. Every objection sounded more cautious. Even the reporters who had expected another routine divorce dispute now realized they were watching something far larger unfold. The new judge reviewed the suspended rulings one by one, explaining each decision carefully for the official record. Several procedural orders issued during previous hearings were set aside pending independent review. The request to remove my Navy Cross was formally withdrawn as having no legal relevance to the property dispute before the court. I did not react. I simply nodded once and remained seated. Some victories are too important to celebrate loudly. Claire sat motionless beside her attorney. The confidence that had defined her throughout the proceedings had disappeared. Behind quiet uncertainty, she avoided looking in my direction, instead focusing on the legal pad in front of her without writing a single word. Her attorney requested a recess to consult with his client, but the judge declined, explaining that transparency required the record to continue while all parties remained present. Daniel then presented the financial documentation we had prepared months earlier. Every business account, every property deed, every trust agreement, and every ownership record had already been disclosed according to state law. Independent auditors confirmed the company books were accurate. Tax filings matched every reported asset. The accusations that I had concealed wealth or manipulated financial records found no support in the evidence before the court. One by one, the claims that had shaped the divorce began losing their foundation. The judge spoke directly to both legal teams. This court decides cases on verified facts, not assumptions or public perception. His words were calm, but they carried the authority that had been missing throughout the earlier hearings. Claire's attorney quietly withdrew several pending requests regarding additional financial penalties. The atmosphere shifted again, not because anyone had won, but because the truth no longer needed to compete with carefully crafted narratives. During another brief recess, a court administrator entered and quietly handed the judge an official memorandum. After reviewing it, the judge announced for the record that the previously assigned judge had been temporarily relieved from presiding over active cases while the Judicial Conduct Commission completed its review. He offered no further comment, and none was necessary. The room understood exactly what that meant. I looked down at the Navy cross resting against my jacket. For the first time all day, I noticed how ordinary it felt. It had never possessed any power by itself. The honor represented years of service, responsibility, and choices made when nobody promised recognition. No courtroom order could change that. Claire finally looked toward me. There was no anger left in her expression, only the quiet realization that the story she had spent months building no longer matched the evidence before the court. I felt no satisfaction watching that moment. 14 years of marriage cannot be measured by legal victories or public embarrassment. They leave behind something far more complicated than either success or failure. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the courtroom floor, I understood that justice was not arriving because I had spoken louder than anyone else. It arrived because facts remained patient. They waited while opinions rushed ahead, and when the time finally came, they spoke clearly enough that no one in the room could pretend not to hear them.